Have you ever heard of a phrase called the hungry gap? No, it's not getting snackish while shopping at the Gap. No. So for Americans and people who don't live in places like Europe, Great Britain, you might not be familiar with the term hungry gap, but it's really important to us, especially places like the Pacific Northwest, all of the northern states. Basically, it really does matter. I would go so far as to say I think it probably matters everywhere, and you might need to tweak the definition a little bit to make it suit your location. But in Washington State, Zone 8, the Pacific Northwest, in a temperature climate that's very similar to that of Europe, the hungry gap is maybe an unfamiliar term, but it's a very familiar reality for those of us living in these temperate climates. I first learned about the hungry gap many years ago while watching YouTube videos about gardening. And there were these British gardeners who kept talking about the hungry gap. And they talked about it as if it was common sense for us to know this. And I actually had to do some research to figure out what in the heck are they talking about. And so what I found out is that the hungry gap is like an agricultural term that talks about the time between, it's usually like early spring, but the time between when all of your stored up food is gone, you've used up all your jellies and jams and your wheat or whatever you have stored, and the time when you start harvesting your first crops. And for most farms in temperate climates and colder, that would be between March and May. March, April, May. Okay. So that's the time period between when like all your jellies and jams and all your preserves, pickles and so forth, all that stuff is like off the shelf. You've eaten it all. You've consumed it all. And the garden that you're planting is either the ground isn't workable yet to actually have your garden, or what you have planted is not yet mature to be harvested. So March, April, May, that's 3 months to be hungry, basically. That there's very little to eat. Perhaps during these times, people might start slaughtering some of their animals. Maybe they're going to, butcher their family cow. Maybe they're going to, take up extra jobs and try to barter or whatever with other people. Or they might start sprouting and eating some of their seeds that are supposed to be for growing, and that could be kind of desperate because then you wouldn't have those seeds for planting. So those are some possibilities on dealing with it, or they could literally just start getting very, very skinny and start to starve to death. And I sure hope that doesn't happen to anybody here. In countries like the United States, it's very rare for people to know what it feels like to go hungry, to go to bed literally without any food in your belly. If we do, it's usually by choice. Like we decide, oh, I'm not going to eat after a certain time of day, or you're going to do intermittent fasting, or you're trying to lose weight, you're dieting, whatever. But most people in the United States don't go to bed hungry, and we don't really know what hunger feels like. We might feel our tummies grumbling when it's time for dinner, but we don't necessarily know what it feels like to not have that sated. We are so used to having something. It might not be your favorite thing. Even people who are in poverty in the United States usually have something to eat. It might not be the most nutritious thing. It might not be a favorite. It might not be comfort food. It might be something that is, terrible. But most of us don't know what it feels like to literally starve. And that could be changing in the future. And so it's kind of on my mind to share this with you, that the hungry gap can be for months. And for those of us who aren't gardening and who aren't prepping, it could be for much, much longer than that. When I first started gardening, I always planted trees, which was really beneficial because those perennials, and I always had herbs, those perennials are like a go-to. They're there all year long. Like even rosemary, my rosemary is growing all year long. I can pick fresh rosemary from my garden even when it's snowing. So I always had that going for me. But when I first started really getting into gardening, like this is going to be a food supply situation, I didn't realize that you could stagger and stagger your planting dates and replant when you harvest, or like even you have multiple gardens going on. So I would basically only plant, like I would plant everything in April during my spring break. I'd plant all my seeds, and then when the last frost is gone, or the last frost of the year is over, I would plant those things out, and then I would just harvest things as they came to maturity. Over the years, I learned to start planting things after that and to actually stagger it. So it's like I would start some things in April, some things in March, some things in May, and then in between. And whenever a spot opened up, when I harvested something, I planted something else in its place. Hopefully, like with some thought as to soil longevity. So I would plant beans after I planted something, or if I was letting the soil rest for a little bit, I might add more organic matter to it so that your soil doesn't get depleted. But I basically learned over the years to stagger those start dates. It's really, really important because the hungry gap might be a lot longer than a few months. So when I would find a really good harvest would be like back in the days when I only planted in April. Some of the plants I would plant, and it would be like the first week of April, might take 2 months. So then that means all of April, all of May, there's nothing to pick, right? So then the beginning of June, I'd start getting that harvest. Some things would take 90 days, and that means I wasn't harvesting till July. Some things took 120 days, like pumpkins and other kinds of squash, and that means I was into August. And some things finally might get multiple harvests off of something. So September, there would still be some tomatoes growing, things like that. The only things I would really start really early would be tomatoes and peppers. Peppers have never done really excellent here. Like we've gotten some, but not like a substantial harvest. I'm still going to do it because we like those things. But tomatoes have been really good for us. They've grown very, very well, but they take 8 to 12 weeks growing inside before setting them out. So that's something to think about too with timing. So those are growing for a really long time before they start to produce something that's edible for us. So with the hungry gap, if you are to translate it to what it means to us, so in certain cultures in parts of the world, it means March, April, May, right? But it's called the hungry gap, right? So how long are you hungry? What's that period of time? So if you don't have a garden and you run out of food, your hungry gap is all that time. So let's say you have 2 months of food in your pantry and you're not a gardener. That means you have a 10-month hungry gap. I think that means someone's getting buried. If you have a garden, if you have perennial fruit and nut trees and berries and all that kind of stuff, maybe you grow potatoes, maybe you grow sunchokes, lots of tubers. I mean, grow whatever root crops you can. A lot of the root crops tend to have better storage, can possibly overwinter outside, like carrots. If you don't pick your carrots, which are biennials, they will get kind of woody and they'll go to seed, flower and seed the next spring. But if you left it in the ground, it's like natural refrigeration. There might be some carrot fly, you might get some issues with pests, but all in all, I have found carrots and beets as biennials perfect for having something during that time that would be normally a hungry gap. There are a lot of brassicas that are cold hardy, different kinds of kales, Swiss chard, and beets and Swiss chard are the same. It's just that beets and Swiss chard were grown for different purposes. So beets, you get the tuber or the big root, and then Swiss chard, it's for the leaf, but they're actually the same plant. So beets, Swiss chard, kale, collard greens, tree collards, those all have been growing through my winters. Like I even had borage growing, those flowers, they're edible little blue flowers. I wouldn't say that it's going to be enough for sustenance, but I had them growing. They didn't die until like a really hard freeze, the second really hard freeze. So that might be something to grow as well. Trying to keep your pollinators alive all year long, it can be a hassle. So grow some things that flower at different times to draw in those pollinators. The hungry gap is a reality for a lot of people around the world, and for our ancestors, it meant life or death. It very well could mean life or death again, and especially if you consider all the food that we have shipped in from around the world. If anything was to ever interfere with that shipment and with getting things from one place to place, we live, well, in the Pacific Northwest, we live near where there's lots of ports. So as long as the ports are open, we'll get food that way. We also have a lot of food trucked in. If you're like, you know, in the central United States, everything has to be shipped in. You don't have access to a port. So you're really limited if there was to be some kind of natural disaster, anything that might interrupt the supply chain. So how are you going to get your food? How are you going to keep it going in those hard times? And how long is your hungry gap? If you only plant a garden that is like your spring garden, you plant your spring garden and you harvest it, your hungry gap is going to be very long. Okay, because if you only plant, let's say you planted I'll say tomato, I'll include tomatoes in there. If I planted like in March indoors my tomatoes, and then in April indoors I planted a bunch of other things, and then I set them out in May, right? I'm still not getting a harvest for a couple more months. So if we're living off of the jams and jellies and pickles and kimchi and all the different things that you can preserve, preserving could be dry, like air dried, sun dried, freeze dried, pickled, jams, jellies, and all that stuff. Even things that are just like rice and beans, they can dry naturally. So if all of those things get eaten up, right? You've had it in your pantry and it's all gone. By when? What time of year would those things be gone? And how long will it take you to have planted and start harvesting your crops? That's how long your personal hungry gap is. And for us in the United States, for most people, that's 12 months. In the United States and a lot of other first world countries, the hungry gap would be 12 months, which means literally there's no insurance policy for food security in the United States. Let's say, pretend for a second, that for whatever reason, you couldn't leave your house. If you could not leave your house, how much food do you have access to in your home and in your own property? How long would it be before you started to go to bed hungry? How long would it be before you sent your children to bed, not for behavior issues, but you sent your children to bed without having a meal? How long before you had to ration your meals, ration your food? Before you started counting out calories, how many calories you could have per day. Not how many calories you want to have to lose weight, but you start to dole it out as in measuring out, okay, well, a cup of this is this much calories, because you're trying to make sure that you don't waste away. So that's how long you have. Because at any given time, something could happen and you could have to rely on the food that you have in your pantry and what you could possibly grow in your garden. I think it's really important for us to be aware of what it means to have a hungry gap, and I want you to calculate how long yours would be. So think, how long could you and your family live on the food you have in your refrigerator and freezer? If all you had was in your refrigerator and freezer, how long do you think you could go? In my refrigerator and freezer, I think we could go a couple weeks. Okay, a couple weeks, if that's all we had. How long could you go on just what you have in your kitchen cabinets? The stuff that you have handy and ready. Okay. I think we could go a couple more weeks. So that's a month. So if you count with just what's in my cabinets by my sink and what I have in the refrigerator and freezer, I think we could go 1 month. Now, we wouldn't like the food. You'd be like having the same thing over and over again, or random ingredients just thrown together. But we could go a month on what we have. Now, we also prep up rice and beans and stuff like that. And I'm not going to share with you how long I can go on that. But if I just think about what a typical person has, I think a month would be generous. And then if you think about, okay, well, I have a cherry tree in the front yard, and I have apple trees and this and that, whatever I had to begin with before I started planting everything, whatever just came with the house. Like, if you ate every apple and you ate every cherry, I could probably squeeze in a couple more weeks on just those if you had a way to preserve them. What could you preserve? How long could you live off of the fruit and nut trees, whatever you have growing on your property? Foraging is nice. I've never seen enough to forage where it could actually substantiate an entire meal, but it could definitely add to it. There's a lot of different edible things around that could be added, kind of stretch it a little bit further, but not enough for it to be a considerable amount of calories. How much cat food and dog food do you have saved? Do you have chickens? Do you have a lot of cracked corn and hen layer feed? Do you have a mealworm farm to give them protein? What do you have for them? Are they free range? How much are you currently feeding them? Because when it comes to the hungry gap, it's not just humans who will be hungry. It's also all of our pets. That's one thing to think about, is if you're really ready to take on the responsibility of having a lot of animals, or even having one. There are some animals that can eat the same foods as us, but not all of them. So if you have a lot of food prepped up and you run out of dog food, you might end up feeding your dogs your rice. You might end up giving them some of your leftovers, and it might not be too good for them either. You might end up giving them some carrots and broccoli and stuff like that. You might end up having to spare some of your eggs for them if you have hens. So it's something to think about. The burden of having pets, along with possible starvation. How likely is it that we'll actually experience a really long hungry gap? Based on my lifetime, very small. But my grandmother lived through the Great Depression, and they barely had any food to eat. When they went through the Great Depression, I remember my grandma told me that they were farmers. They had like 14 living children, and this is in South Dakota. My grandma said that they had lived on a farm, and they raised cattle, but they were so poor that they couldn't eat the meat when they slaughtered it. They would just save the blood, and then they would soak bread in the blood, and then they would bake that, and it was kind of like a blood sausage or something like that. It sounds really disgusting, but that was what they were able to eat. They had very, very little food, and my grandma told me the stories of the Native Americans actually would come to their door and ask if they could please spare something, and my great-great-grandmother would always find something to spare, but it was not without sacrifice, because they were starving too. So they did not do well during the Great Depression, although my grandma said it wasn't very different from their day-to-day life because they were already so poor. So people who are extremely poor, when something happens, it might not be that big of a change to them. People who are middle class probably would be pretty shocked by the level of, by the change that would occur, because they're used to having whatever they want and not eating whatever's left and whatever's available. We're so used to saying, "What's for dinner?" Or, "What do you feel like having for dinner tonight?" Not, "Is there dinner tonight? Is there anything to mix together that we could make a dinner that would make any sense?" My mom told me once that when she was little, my grandfather was out of his job for a little bit, and my grandma didn't have anything in the fridge. I mean, she didn't have anything on the shelves. She just had a little bit of flour, and she fried it. She fried the flour, didn't have salt, didn't have anything else in it, and my mom wouldn't eat it, and my grandma cried. And she had to let her kids go to bed hungry. They had no edible food. It was like cardboard. So something to think about with uncertainty in the future. You never know. It's a great insurance policy. We're constantly having insurance policies for everything. Why not food? That doesn't make any sense. We have insurance policies for property. I've never had a claim on my homeowner's insurance. Like, it's been 20 something years since I've had a claim on my car insurance. And, you know, I've had like short-term disability insurance and never used it. So, we have all kinds of insurance, but what really matters, air, water, food, shelter. I don't want anyone to experience starvation. It sounds like a very painful experience. I've never experienced that myself. I did suffer from anorexia as a child and a young woman, but that was my own mental health issues. But starving to death would be a horrible way to go. And also, if you're trying to accomplish anything, you're trying to get work done, if you're trying to like be active or whatever, if you're trying to do that without calories, it's very, very difficult. Watching your children go hungry and cry and complain and suffer, that's horrible. So you want to prevent that. You want to make sure that you have a pantry and that you keep it stocked and rotated, and that you have a really strong garden. And if you want more of that, watch some of my videos. I'm always talking about frugal living, which means you have more money that can stretch further so you can stock your pantry. And then you also, besides having a stocked pantry and all that, you want skills. You want to be able to identify what you can eat, and you want to be able to grow it. So be good, be sweet, grow a garden if you want to eat, and I'll see you next time.